a very good thinker. And I just got a notification it was recording in progress. So I had to tell it was okay. And so we'll talk about Abraham Kuyper, and his thought is relevant to Catholics and Protestants, but also to people of all stripes. I think it is a really good paradigm for allowing society to flourish. We'll do that, and then I'm going to relate Kuyper's thought to Catholic social thought, since Kuyper was not Catholic, and then wrap up by talking a little bit about coalition building, multi-party systems. I'm not a proponent of a two-party system. I think it's become increasingly toxic in the U.S. and can't contain the diversity that we have, and the two parties feed each other and just toss elections back and forth. And I do think there are two paths forward for a multi-party system. One that's fairly easy with the way things are set up now, to expand to have 3, 4, 5 parties that are influential rather than just two. And then there's also a tweak we could make, an amendment to the Constitution that would make things a lot easier. So let me start by just talking about Christian democratic parties. They arose in 19th century Europe, and usually were built out of Catholic social thought or out of what's called Neo-Calvinist thought, which is a form of Protestant thinking. And often these parties are kind of a combination of both Catholic and Protestant. They tend to be center-right on social and moral issues, and tend to be center-left on political issues, although it varies based on context. So in Europe, they tend to be considered center-right, and then in Latin America, Christian democratic parties tend to be center-left. And so this is kind of the broad kind of picture of what a Christian Democratic Party is. And then Kuyper provides an instance of somebody who founded a CDP. And I'm going to talk about the philosophy of society that he has that undergirds it. And it's one that can be adhered to if you're a Christian or not a Christian, but it will fit quite easily for people who are Christian. So Kuyper lived in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and started out as a pastor, but he ended up founding a university, private university, because he believed that there should be options in education. He founded a national newspaper, a political party, not so snappily named the Anti-Revolutionary Party, because it was against the French Revolution and kind of the bloodshed and the violence that comes out of ideological revolutions. And then he was in Parliament in the Netherlands, and then finally became Prime Minister of the Netherlands. So I like the guy enough that I named my only son after him. My son's name is Kuyper. He didn't get beat up in kindergarten for having that name, so we made it out of that alive. But anyway, so Kuyper's not a perfect guy, but he was great, and he's kind of formed the foundation of my thinking. So the first principle we want to talk about is something called sphere sovereignty. Not a spear that you would chuck, but a sphere, like the spatial analogy, a sphere sovereignty. It's not very well named in English. It just doesn't make sense to people. But here's what Kuyper was trying to say. I think he was right. He said, if you look at patterns in history and patterns in scripture, both of them say the same thing, that the world is composed of, and Kuyper would say God created different kinds of culture, right? Just like there's different kinds of animals, different kinds of vegetation, different kinds of people, there are also different kinds of culture. And those used a spatial analogy and compared each kind of culture to a sphere, and argued that each kind of culture has its own unique center and its own unique circumference. And by its unique center, he means it has its own unique reason for being. So art, science, education, politics, marriage and family, these different sports and competition, business and entrepreneurship, these different kinds of culture have a unique reason for being that's different than the reason for being of the other cultural spheres. So on this sphere analogy, each sphere has a center, reason for being, but also has a circumference that's drawn around the center. And the circumference is limits to their jurisdiction, right? And so if the arts exist for the purpose of producing aesthetic excellence or beauty, then that's what they do. And it also says that there are other things that the arts don't do and shouldn't try to do. And if the sciences are there to gain knowledge about the natural world, then that's what it does. But the other things that the realm of science shouldn't try to do. If government exists to achieve justice for the various individuals and communities under its purview, then it should do that and not swim outside of its lane and do other things. If the church and religious institutions exist to help people order their lives spiritually and psychologically, then that's what the church should do as an institution, and it shouldn't try, for example, to run the country. That's what the government does. And so this is sphere sovereignty. And in relation to politics, the center of politics, Kuyper argued, that its reason for being is to achieve justice for the various individuals and communities under its purview. And therefore, government also has a circumference. It's got limits to its jurisdiction. And Kuyper gave an analogy with the natural world. He said that governments tend to be like a government tends to be like a giant octopus, that it just grows to enormous proportions until its tentacles reach into all of the other spheres and meddle in ways that it probably shouldn't. But I do want to give a qualification here, since we're Americans and libertarians are kind of a big force in American politics. Kuyper was no libertarian, and neither am I. He was not saying that the government shouldn't ever interfere, shouldn't ever step in to other domains. He was just saying that as a general rule, the government should swim in its lane. And then he gave, and I'll talk about this in a minute, he gave 3 exceptions to that when the government can swim outside of its lane. And I'll give those in just a moment. But I just wanted to mention briefly on the question of church and state. Kuyper believed that religion and politics can't be separated, but that church and state can be separated and should be. And by religion and politics, he just means that whatever a person holds most deeply in their heart, they hold it religiously in a faith-based manner, whether it's an organized religion or not, that everybody has an organizing principle, something that their head and their heart center on, and that because it's the organizing center of their life, it's going to affect their politics, no matter what. So that can't be separated. But what can be separated is church and state. The church as an institution, or a mosque as an institution, should not try to rule the country. It is not competent to do so, and it's not its proper place. And vice versa. So Kuyper wanted to avoid statism on the one hand and ecclesiasticism on the other. So statism is just when the government swells to enormous proportions and meddles where it shouldn't meddle. And ecclesiasticism is when the church swells to enormous proportions and meddles where it shouldn't meddle. So now the government and the church each have a limited transcendence over the other spheres under Kuyper's thought. I think he's right. So let's start with the government. He gives 3 categories in which the government can step outside of what it normally does into the other spheres. The first is what we could call inter-spherical situations. So within a given cultural sphere, the government can step in sometimes to adjudicate, to be an umpire. For example, within the sphere of marriage and family, the government can step in to protect the weak from the strong. So if you have a stepfather abusing his stepchild, the government can step in and punish him for it and rescue the child. And so there are instances when the government needs to step in to protect the weak from the strong. Then you have a second situation in which the government certainly can and should interfere, and that is intraspherical disputes. So sometimes you've got a dispute between 2 different spheres. Give an example. Let's say that a guy wants to open a gentleman's club and wants to do so next to an elementary school. Perfectly fine for the government to come in and say, you know what? The property that you want to buy is zoned in such a way that it's appropriate for elementary school kids, and your institution is not appropriate for the elementary school kids to see or experience. And so, and there's other instances like that. I just tried to pick kind of an obvious instance. And then the third category in which the government can and should step outside of its lane is what could be called transspherical matters. And these are issues of significance that transcend all the spheres. For example, road systems. Perfectly fine for the government to regulate roads, highways, and so forth, because those serve all of the different spheres. And so those are the 3 ways in which the government transcends other spheres. And then Kuyper also argued, however, that the church and similar institutions, different types of nonprofit institutions, transcend the other spheres. And that is that churches and religious organizations and nonprofit organizations exist as institutions and as organisms. So as an institution, they've got a formal thing that they do. But they also have an informal thing that they do, which is after their members leave on Sunday morning, just use the church as an example, the church has taught them and shaped them in such a way that they're going to act differently when they go out into the other cultural spheres: art, science, government, sports, family, etc. And so churches and religious organizations and nonprofit organizations have that ability to influence, an organic influence. Now Paul told me that if I went longer than 20 to 30 minutes, that he had hired a linebacker who lives in Raleigh. He's going to fly across the screen and tackle me. And so I'm not a very big guy.
This is untrue.
I'm a little afraid right now, so I'm going to wrap up within 10 minutes. If you're getting bored, don't worry. I'm going to have mercy on you. It's going to be over with soon.
Real quickly, we will do a Q&A afterward, after you're done.
So I want to relate Kuyper's thought. Kuyper was Protestant, but when he wrote his social and cultural thought, he did it with Catholic social teaching at his elbow. And it's a little bit distinct from Catholic social teaching. And so I'll talk about some of the similarities and differences. The strong similarity between Kuyper's sphere sovereignty and the last couple hundred years of Catholic social thought, and I'm part of a Catholic, evangelical and Catholic think tank. And so I've got lots of very close friends, who are Catholic. My family is too. One side of my family is. And the great similarity with the Catholic notion of subsidiarity and even also solidarity, but we'll start with subsidiarity, is that Kuyper's thought and Catholic social teaching rightly want to make a big deal out of all of the institutions in society, that the government shouldn't dwarf and sort of smother out these other institutions. Now, these other institutions are often called mediating institutions. That's become popular language in the past 50 years. And that what's best is for the government to kind of, if possible, stay out of things and let, in Catholic social teaching, they would say lower level institutions handle them, because lower level institutions are closer to the ground. They know the people they're dealing with better. And so if it can be handled at a lower level, handle it at a lower level. And Kuyper's thought is very similar to that, and emphasized the importance of institutions like family, church, business and commerce, and that kind of thing. That you want those institutions to be strong so that society can flourish. And so they both guard against the state's totalizing tendencies, and they both want other institutions to flourish. They both focus on human dignity as a big part of their platforms. The way they're different is that Catholic social teaching has often been more hierarchical than Kuyper's. Kuyper's is more flat. The government is not higher than the church is not higher than the government. All of the spheres exist on the same level. Whereas in Catholic social teaching, all of these different, they're not called cultural spheres in Catholic teaching, but the cultural spheres are organic related, but more hierarchically related. So that's a difference. All right, so what is the value of Christian democratic parties in a post-Christian world? So let me just address that briefly. I think there's great value, especially in a post-Christian world. And I would start by saying that Christian democratic parties are built largely on principles that are accessible to all people and not just to Christians. Most of the principles are available by studying the world and studying history. A lot of the patterns and principles, I think, although some of the beliefs are more distinctive to Christianity. But I do think Christian democratic parties can put forth a vision of society, philosophy of society, political philosophy, if you will. In Europe, it's called social philosophy, often, that does provide justice, freedom, and equality for various and diverse individuals and communities. And then finally, CDPs recognize that all people have ultimate commitments, of some sort, religious commitments, if you will, whether it's formal or informal, and that those commitments are faith-based ultimately in one way or another. If you choose a principle as ultimate, make it ultimate. If it's your number one ordering principle, there's a point at which you can't prove that that should be the organizing principle. So they're faith-based in a sense, and because they're faith-based, and because they include ultimate principles, they're definitely going to radiate outward into your political actions and beliefs. So that's some of the value in a post-Christian world. Another valuable thing, I think, is putting our cards on the table. I've noticed, so I was trained in philosophical theology. I was trained in a Christian discipline, but I speak at secular political party meetings and universities all the time. And I've noticed when I'm trying to convince people on a given point, people who are not Christians or whose Christianity is different than mine, when I try to do so based on neutral principles, often they'll articulate that they think it's smoke and mirrors, that I really believe it because the Bible says it. And so what they actually want me to do is put my cards on the table. And when I put my cards on the table, it's actually a combination of both. I've got more neutral reasons for believing what I believe, and then I've got more specifically Christian reasons. And anyway, a Christian Democratic Party goes ahead and puts its cards on the table and says, here's where we got some of our principles. I'll talk about coalition building. One of the neat things I think about your party is that I think it stands a chance of making a difference. And there aren't many parties who stand a chance of doing so. And I've got 8, I wrote an article a few years ago, and the image that went with the article was a huge dumpster fire. And it was in 2016, right after the election. And my argument was, here's why we need a multi-party system instead of a two-party system. And it got an enormous amount of hits, and it made some people really upset. Because I've operated in GOP circles, I don't really fit anywhere exactly. But anyway, it made everybody upset. Being an opinion writer gives me the opportunity over the course of my lifetime to offend nearly everyone I've ever met. And that article got a lot of response. But what I argued, I gave 8 reasons, best I could do. I'm sure there's 9 or 10, but I came up with 8 reasons that we need a multi-party system. And so I think the two major parties just toss elections back and forth to each other. They depend on each other. They enable each other. They enable each other's worst tendencies, just by the nature of being a two-party system. And now that our nation has grown more diverse, neither of the two parties can even come close to containing the diversity when they're in their own camps. You got an enormous amount of turmoil in both parties. And so one path forward, the easiest one, is just to, especially in a day of social media, of just marketing and promoting other parties and showing the value and kind of breaking out of the mold a little bit. That as Americans, we're not just going to, eat whatever's handed to us on a platter by one of the two parties. The more difficult thing would be to make a little revision to the way House of Representatives are elected and organized. And that would be to do proportional representation, which is, you know what that is. And I think that would be really healthy for everyone in a given state to be able to have somebody who actually represents what they believe. And so instead of dividing up representation by districts, divide it up by allegiances. And that's a bit of a stretch in America, given how entrenched the two parties are. But I think this would produce more viable presidential nominees. It would produce perhaps a Congress that would actually get things done. We got serious gridlock. Congress does not do its job. Congressmen in general try to get reelected for 4 years. That's what they try to do. And so they hand everything off to the president and then makes executive decisions, which all then get reversed 4 years later. So deeply dysfunctional system right now. And then, yeah, so I'll conclude because it's 8:30 and the linebacker is going to hit me at 8:31 if I keep talking, but I think we're going to do some Q&A. Paul?
Okay. Actually, one question came in. Christopher asked it already. It's in the chat. Actually, Chris, if you can mic yourself and ask the question in the background.
Sure. I guess my question was just, I'm not as familiar with Kuyper and the concept of sphere sovereignty, but when you talked about the relationship between church and state, it sounded a lot like in the Byzantine Empire, they had the concept of symphonia, in which both church and empire had a lot of authority and they engaged each other pretty regularly. But they had pretty clearly defined domains, at least under good circumstances.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, I think there is definitely similarity there. And then Kuyper, his addition there was showing how the church exists both as an institution and as an organism, and that a lot of the political work of the church is the church as an organism, which means not when it meets formally as an institution, but when it shapes its members' thinking so that as they go out into society, they think and act, hopefully in a more, whatever the word is, more helpful manner than they would have otherwise. We just don't want to go back to the situation where we have popes and kings meddling, popes trying to appoint kings in Europe, and then kings trying to appoint bishops.
Right. Okay, thank you.
Yep, thank you, Christopher.
Anybody else have a question?
Or you can just tell me that's the dumbest talk you'd ever heard, and you're glad I landed the plane at 8:30. I mean, whatever you need to get off.
I've got a question, and again, kind of sort of the cards on the table, bigger type question. I really like what you said about the whole, you can't separate religion and politics, but you can separate church and state. That really struck a chord. What I do wonder though is, like, where does compromise come into this? Like, if the American Solidarity Party gets big and elects people, and what if abortion is often a hot topic? So what if there's a bill that says, well, ban all abortion except in cases of rape? Just hypothetically, like, so where does does compromise play into that? Because like, on the one hand, you can say it's really going against my pro-life thing, but from a political standpoint, it's still actually, it achieves a lot of what people. Yeah,
that's a great question. I mean, and that's the trick. I mean, that's the rub in the political sphere, is that just by the nature of living in Christian democratic parties are usually a form of principled pluralism. That's what Kuyper was. That's what ASP is. That you think that people ought to be able to live according to their own beliefs, etc. And so you live in a diverse country, and just by the nature of it, you're going to have to make compromises. And sometimes wisdom and discernment will dictate that we will not vote for a certain bill, because even though it bends toward us and gives us some of what we want, the issue is so important that we have to make a statement that we're not going to bend and compromise. In other cases, wisdom and discernment dictate, you know what, we'll take what we can get. And different people land in different places and get very angry with each other about where the other person landed. But I don't think I'll probably get a satisfying answer to your question, but I have affirmed that your question is an important one. And
I wasn't expecting a quick, easy answer. So,
well, I would be very happy if we were in a nation where instead of having had 70 million abortions over the past 50 years, we'd only had 1 million, which is even more than the number of probably raped impregnations. That's a fairly low percentage. But yeah, you have to learn to compromise in the political sphere, or else you just end up with authoritarianism. You just you rise to power and then make everyone do what you say, and then you get toppled and somebody else is authoritarian.
And that's probably where, one of the aspects when we talk the pro-life issue, it's not just the legislative issues we often focus on, but we also have to be there culturally to support. And that's something that hopefully the church is doing a good, the church and just societies in general being that support. And also, I mean, we talk about being whole life, pro-life, whole life, having the support so women don't feel they have no choice in the matter, but to have an
Right.
abortion, which is something there. Daniel, did you want to ask your question?
A final comment. I am so jaded politically these days that I
Yeah.
simply tell people I vote for the person that'll do the least amount of damage.
Yeah.
And so it would be nice to have a party platform. I could say, this is what I believe in. And that would be refreshing. And I think I have a lot of friends, not progressives, but liberal as well as conservative, that would feel the same way.
Yep. Well, you know, it's interesting. I guess it's not interesting for most people but yeah, I was so idealist when I was young. I mean, I'm 46, so some people think that's young. It doesn't feel young, but I've come around past 5 or 6 years, especially. Just, we can never transform our society. It'll never happen because people will never, human beings are screw ups. We all are. So it's never going to be great. But I do think we can make incremental change, and we can make things less bad. Maybe Daniel would like that language. We can make things a little less bad than they would have been otherwise, right? That usually gets a chuckle because people kind of understand intuitively that most people do, I think. So
Nobody likes politicians these days, but they may like a story.
yeah, don't vote for politicians. It just encourages them.
Well, let's move on to another question. And Chris, I know you said you need to get out of here, so let's go to you next, and then we'll go to Sherry. So Chris, what's your next question?
Sure. Sorry about that.
No, it's okay.
And Bruce, I just put in the chat, we should make bumper stickers that say "Make America Less Bad." I think
Let's make America less bad again.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, my question is, talking about the goals of the party in terms of real policy and the way that it really affects people, I see a lot of opportunity to frame it as sort of building on the foundation of Aristotle, kind of the classical tradition. It's very humanist, I would say, but it's a holistic humanism. It respects the life of the person. It respects the spiritual aspect of the person. It respects the community around the person. It's not just a party of the will. And I think that's what the two main parties are. They're about the human will and maybe material aspects and not much else. So I wonder, with your background in philosophical theology and kind of this history of Christian democracy, what do you see as value added, or is there value added in explicitly, planting our flag as we're a Christian democratic party versus we are a holistic humanist party?
Yeah, so that's a big question. I'll do my best to give a satisfying answer. I want to give you this answer that's the least dissatisfying.
Yeah, and I'd say not an academic answer, but kind of your gut. What do you think is the value?
So I think a couple of things. I'm going to start at a little different place than what you asked, but I'm going to get there. Just because it's what came to mind. So as a Christian, I usually, when I go into a situation where I'm trying to persuade, so I'm just talking about personal persuasion at the moment and not specifically about political parties. I know that I can use one of two types of reasoning. The first type of reasoning I can use is relatively neutral, where you try to appeal to common ground, common principles, principles that you hope will be common to all. And that used to be a lot more possible. And I still do it. Take the issue of abortion. When I speak, often I'll spend the majority of my time, or even the whole time, giving sociological, legal, and medical reasons that the Roe v. Wade apparatus and the rulings that came after it are bad for babies, for women, for men, for law-governed democracy, for society, for families, for children. And so I give relatively neutral lines of reasoning. I don't put all my cards on the table. That's a little bit less possible now because things are so ideological in the West that everything is so heavily ideological that it's just become much more obvious that everybody has faith-based commitments. Expressive individualism, critical race theory, all the major ideologies are oughts rather than ises.
Sure.
You know,
Kind of
right.
postmodern perspective.
So, but the other form of reasoning that I engage in when I'm trying to persuade is distinctively Christian forms of reasoning. I've found, and I've got a pretty broad array of people I try to persuade. I've got progressive activists who show up at my public speaking engagements sometimes, and these are to the left of the left. And then I've got people on the right who can't stand me. And so there's all kinds of people that I've tried to persuade, and often they actually just really want me to put my cards on the table. Because if I don't, it just looks like special pleading, that I'm pretending that I believe such and such for this reason. So what I usually do now is I give both kinds of reasoning on a given issue. And so if we're talking abortion, I talk about human dignity from the scriptures, that the Bible's teaching on human dignity. And then I also give legal, medical, sociological, philosophical lines of reasoning from more neutral premises, more neutral forms of reasoning. So I usually give both, but in a given situation, I might use just one or the other. Now, to bring that to the political party, I think on the whole, it's a positive to put your cards on the table as you name, as you describe your party. And because of ideological currents today, it's certainly acceptable to do so. And no one's going to really believe you if you say you believe something for neutral reasons. They're not going to really believe that. They want you to put your cards on the table. So that's the situation that we're in.
Okay.
And I think when we do that too, people are persuaded by stories. And the Bible provides, in my opinion, the true story of the whole world. I think that the disparate collection of books and authors come together, coalesce to give us a narrative about the world. And I think it's a deeply, profoundly moving narrative. And it gives us a chance to tell that narrative in a broad manner, that there's a design to the world and that design has been misdirected by humans, and that we can provide redirection. And that we shouldn't get our hopes up too much, because we're never going to take a great leap forward morally, because all human beings are morally flawed. And no amount of education is going to change that, because the flaw is in the heart, not in the head. So that's a reason that I think, another reason I think it's helpful.
Okay. So in I guess kind of my takeaway from that is the neutral appeal is beneficial in some cases.
Mhm.
That more postmodern or honest about commitments, I
Yep.
think is especially good in kind of direct one-to-one interactions, because then it's more personal that way.
Mhm.
And we can make use of that narrative, but maybe broaden it, maybe not quite to sort of the
Right.
founders level deism,
Right.
but we can say, coming from that Judeo-Christian or that monotheistic tradition, we believe in human depravity, we believe that there is a God, we believe that there is order to the universe, and kind of use that as part of what you described as that compelling narrative to then help further what we see as goals for the benefit of all people, whether they're part of our party or not.
Yeah.
Okay. Great. Thank you so much.
Mhm.
Okay, any other questions for Bruce? Because we've got about just a few minutes left. Just mute yourself and go for it.
Well, just a quick question or comment from you is, Christian democratic, the Christian is a loaded term, but humanism is no less loaded in the vernacular.
Right.
But
Yeah.
most of the people I hang out with like things that talk about common good, however
Yeah.
that's phrased. But that seems to be a much more attractive, because we've got historical reasons to have that backed up, as well as I just didn't think in the vernacular it's better. But
Yeah, I think, the phrase common good is appealing to the everyday ear, and except for libertarians. Libertarians don't believe there's a common good. There's only the individual good. But I think that, in fact, my website is called Christianity for the Common Good. That's the name of it. See, I like you. I knew I liked you, Daniel. I could tell the minute I saw you, this guy is smart. I do think the idea of common ground is very important. And I think Christian Democratic parties can show that you can find common ground with any kind of voter in America. At least common concerns, even if you disagree on solutions. And so we do want to find common ground. And there's always at least common concerns, even if we differ pretty radically on solutions. You can find some common ground with common concerns. And then once you start with the concern, you can reason toward your solution. Yeah. So.
All right, any other questions?
I just had a quick clarifying question about sort of the sphere of influence of Kuyperian thought.
Mm-hmm.
I'm Catholic myself, so I hear Catholic social teaching and Kuyperian thought, and I'm not sure which, if that's very popular among all denominations of Christianity, or if it's specific to a couple, or.
Yeah. So it was has become very influential in Baptist thought. I'm one of the reasons. I mean, have been the major Kuyperian thought thinker, and I've taught a huge seminary, Baptist seminary, but there's a number of other Baptists who, a lot of my PhD students and so forth, who are Kuyperian. And so it's making some inroads in the Baptist world. And then there's a lot of Kuyperian thought in Christian Reformed Church. That's not a Presbyterian church. It's Reformed, but not Presbyterian. It's a hybrid between Presbyterian and Baptist. And then lots of, so Presbyterian, Christian Reformed Church, Baptists, and then Catholics. There's a decent number of Catholics who are influenced by Kuyper. For example, Eduardo Echeverria is a Kuyperian Catholic. And so there's a Kuyperian moment right now. I mean, Kuyper influenced Richard John Newhouse, who is Catholic. Kuyper influenced Chuck Colson. Kuyper has influenced so many people. Because really compelling vision and compelling person. So, hey, you guys have been great. This is fun. Let's do it again sometime.
All right, let's wrap it up right now. Again, Bruce, thank you for joining us. You did a great job.
Thank you. I enjoyed it. I'm gonna go back in and take care of the kiddos now. They've been great.
And actually, one of the things that you might be talking about on Friday morning on Faith Radio on Mornings with Carmen is that whole idea of the narrative. So people would hear more about that.
Okay. Join me on Faith Radio. We'll have fun. I'll try to have a couple.
AM 900 in the Twin Cities, or anyway.
Send me a message with which politician you'd like me to make fun of on the air, and I'll try to come up with my best one-liner or two. I enjoy making fun of politicians. They deserve it. All right. Good night.
Thanks a lot, Bruce.
Okay. All right. Bye.
Thank you.
Yep.
Well, again, thank you everybody for coming out. It's been a good time talking. Any last minute thoughts? I know a lot of the regular people here. I was hoping to get a few more in, but again, Amy, Sherry, Adam, Isaac, Dan, thanks for coming. And we will catch you hopefully next month. I forget the dates. I don't have that on me, but still working on a guest. If you have any recommendations about a topic or a person you'd like to hear from, email me, or just email the party, or message me on Facebook, or if you have somebody right now, you can put that in the chat. I'll keep that open for a few more minutes. But again, thank you for joining us, and have a great evening.